any like arbitrary time like that. Blocks get created depending on network demand. So if you have a lot of transactions being submitted to the network at the same time, a lot of those transactions will be packaged into what are known as event blocks, or basically just like blocks, and then they get passed around to the validators in the network. And once you get two-thirds, just over two-thirds of the validating power of the network having signed the block, then the block is final. So you don't have to wait for like 5 or 6 block confirmations. You only need to wait for a single block confirmation, and average block reduction has been historically around like 1 second or so. And so, if you submit a transaction to the network, on average, within 1 second, it will be included into the block and signed by the validators in the network, and then confirmed. So, it really is quite fast. It really is quite cheap. The average transaction cost is right now for a fraction of the cent if you're doing an account to account transfer, or maybe you're paying like at least up to like $1 per smart contract interaction when the network gets more congested. So it really is like a lot cheaper than say like Ethereum. And in addition to that, the technology stack that sits on top of it is very familiar to Ethereum. So right now it's like the EVM base. It's all the sort of like Web3 tooling that any like competent Web3 developer on Ethereum would be very familiar with. So the way that you write, compile, and deploy smart contracts on Ethereum works pretty much the same way as on Fantom. Now, we're doing a lot of work in terms of like replacing the middleware over time with, because there are a lot of performance bottlenecks that we've sort of identified. But the key thing is that people will still be able to deploy on Fantom, writing like code that they're familiar with, like Solidity or Viper. So, maintaining that sort of like programming language compatibility, although some people might consider to be a controversial decision, I think it's the right decision, because otherwise it would alienate too many developers. And most developers out there who write smart contracts are familiar with Solidity and and Viper. They're not familiar with more obscure programming languages, shall we say.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, there's already tons of developers that are using a specific language. They're familiar with other Web3 ecosystems, and blockchains and smart contracts. So it makes sense to keep it easier, right? And be able to, hop from chain to chain and be able to build different services across Web3. Michael, I'm curious, like just off the top of my head, I'm also wondering, like, is there like any good place for like people like developers that are listening now to find like good documentation on Fantom and to good resources to help them like start building on the blockchain?
Yeah, sure. So if you go to our website on Fantom.Foundation, there's a lot of resources there. So you see a lot of information on like some of the biggest projects that are by category that have like deployed on Fantom, namely like decentralized finance related projects, or and like NFT related projects. You see docs to like our technical resources. So there's a whole bunch of like technical papers. There's links to our GitHub as well. So the raw source code, which is open source, for everyone to look at, each and every commit. And there's also docs.fantom.foundation. So we have a Git book that kind of like helps people get started on Fantom. So like deploying your first smart contract on Fantom, deploying your first NFT on Fantom, setting up like a node connected to Fantom network, setting up a validator, connecting your MetaMask to Fantom. We have a lot of documentation that kind of walks you step by step. And if you're very familiar with say like the Ethereum development environment, walking through these documents on Fantom should be like relatively straightforward as well. It's basically just like changing like network parameters, etc., running some slightly different commands, but the kind of like logic is very similar to Ethereum development.
That's awesome. I love that you guys are providing those resources. I mean, obviously, Chainlink Labs builds out a lot of documentation as well, and it's so crucial, right, in this space. And I mean, there's so many people learning, building. I'd encourage everyone listening on this call to like attend workshops, hackathons, and stuff. You really don't need to have any experience. Just show up and get started is kind of the name of the game at this point. And there's probably plenty of people at those events that are just like you that that are starting at square one. So definitely attend any workshop or hackathon that you guys can if you're interested in starting development. Michael, I kind of also obviously want to talk to you about about Chainlink and Chainlink Labs. I'm curious, like, when did you first like learn about Chainlink, and when did you first meet Nikki?
So I first heard about Chainlink. This would have been like basically when it was like launching. I think it was like in 2017, 2018, because right from the very beginning, like Chainlink was quite a well-known project. I think it was, if one of the first, or if not like the first, like real like big Oracle provider out there. So Chainlink was very well known to actually quite a lot of people when it was launched, and basically it's been able to get like a lot of traction on a whole bunch of chains. Obviously, it started off like with Ethereum and stayed there for a while, and then has now branched off to other chains as well, including on Fantom. And how I met Nikki was I don't remember the very first conversation, but I think like we were like working with Chainlink, and then I happened to get in contact with him as part of a call, and then we both figured out that we lived in Sydney at the time, and then he didn't live too far away from me. I lived in the city, and he lives like relatively close to the city as well. And then we also like met up in person and had coffee and stuff. So yeah, that's how we kind of like got to know one another, and just kind of like kept in contact every time since. You know, doing these like events together and just like talking offline. And training, I think is, yeah, it definitely is like the biggest oracle in Fantom by far. And what I like about Chainlink is that the documentation is very clear to use. I've gone through it. It's all like pretty. It all pretty much makes sense. Step by step. A lot of people who've used Chainlink, haven't really like mentioned any issues or concerns. In fact, I can't even think off the top of my head like a single person who's sort of like mentioned an issue like using the Chainlink resources. It's just like very reliable, and like a lot of like the DeFi applications in Fantom rely on Chainlink, and you guys probably have the data on your end, like the amount of like queries that people have been making, etc. So you guys have been a massive contribution to our network, and what I also really like about you guys is that you don't really like rush anything, so you don't like feel the pressure just to get something out there without having really tested it. You really like want to put something out there that absolutely 100% works, which is why you guys have taking your time, testing it in private test nets and then public test net and then the main net to really make sure that every single step of the way that everything is working well, and that's very very important because this is kind of like mission critical software. When people are relying on price feeds and they have millions of dollars, if not like billions of dollars, in a variety of different like protocols on Fantom and elsewhere. You got to make sure that every part of the infrastructure is working well, and I think that's why you guys obviously like test a lot, and it's kind of proven in the result and the traction that you guys have managed to get.
I love that. Yeah. I would say like I'm not, obviously not a developer and on that side of the business, but from my exposure, the team is extremely focused, extremely detail oriented, and just been super impressed with everything that I've experienced internally. But Nikki, what has your like experience also been like? Would love to hear what your experience has been like working with Michael and Fantom, and just like your relationship together.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, let me just add a little bit of color to our initial introduction. So, for those listening in, just kind of cast your minds back to early 2021, and bearing in mind things were very different in Australia. We had a closed border, so you couldn't travel internationally, and quite a few lockdowns as well. And so I was obviously meeting with many of our ecosystem partners, and typically that's a Zoom call, right? And typically the person on the other end of that Zoom call is in the US or Europe or some part of Asia. And what was really interesting for me and slightly surreal was exactly as Michael mentioned, we jumped on a call together, started chatting away, and realized that I actually calculated it later. We lived 3 kilometers apart from each other, and I could almost see his building from my bedroom. From across the harbor. So it was kind of a surreal moment of just like, okay, we're actually not that far apart. And obviously we met in person and have collaborated on a number of initiatives since then. So thanks again, Michael. In terms of Fantom, I think there's a few things for us from Chainlink Labs perspective that really appeal in terms of working with Fantom overall. And I think obviously everyone's aware there's hundreds of blockchains out there, and lots of chains claim particular things. But genuinely, from a Chainlink perspective, we truly believe that there's a uniqueness factor with Fantom. And I think first and foremost, and really at the core of it all, for us is actually the Fantom community, right? So partly, when we were engaging with Fantom earlier on, as Michael mentioned, partly that was, that collaborative nature of the community was partly we heard secondhand, so it was partly reputational. We'd obviously been speaking with certain users and so on as well. But once we started to engage with the community more deeply, it really kind of came out to us that there is a very strong community here with the Fantom community, and it's also highly collaborative. What we found, and what many of our account teams have found working with Fantom users, is that Fantom users really want to collaborate with Chainlink, but also collaborate with each other within the Fantom community as well. So that Fantom community is really strong. It stands out to us, and again, a lot of projects, a lot of ecosystems claim community within the blockchain ecosystem, but I think truly Fantom is absolutely a standout in that sense. So that's, for us, that's really appealing in looking for a collaboration partner and working with Fantom. Secondly, there's really some really bold ideas and bold applications being built on Fantom, and we can kind of dig into some of this stuff later in the conversation. But as we kind of surveyed what was being built on Fantom, what we found was that there's some really cool new offerings being built, so dApps that are trying some really innovative concepts. So some that, just as examples, some that stood out were like Beethoven X, which is really this unique kind of combination of AMM, LP, DEX, portfolio manager, or Reaper Farm, which is an auto compounding yield aggregator, but it has this really strong focus on the UX. So what we found was that there's some really unique dApps being built on Fantom. And the final component in terms of that kind of uniqueness factor of Fantom from a Chainlink perspective is really the technical considerations. And Michael outlined those earlier, but fundamentally what a lot of that the consensus mechanisms and so on, and parallelization, what it boils down to is great transaction speed and great transaction costs, relatively speaking. And I think that fundamentally that makes it much easier for us to implement the kind of full range of Chainlink services. And so as we kind of launched into this kind of partnership with Fantom, we launched price feeds actually almost a year ago, so it was the middle of 2021. And again, the responses from the Fantom community, from users, has been tremendous. So now majority of the dApps on Fantom which need price feeds use Chainlink. We have 28 price feeds launched now, covering crypto, fiat, and a range of indices as well, to support users. And at any given time, even at this point in time, with the market situation and so on being what it is, Chainlink is still securing up to about $300 million in value. And so again, it's just kind of a really tremendous response from the Fantom community once we launched. And I think that really provides a very strong foundation for what we want to talk about here today with regards to VRF and keepers.
Yeah. I love that. The ecosystem is already starting to take advantage of price feeds, and I'm sure that they're very, very excited about VRF and keepers. Nikki, from your perspective, with VRF and keepers now live on Fantom, in your opinion, what do you think these tools are going to enable for the ecosystem? Do you think and what kind of new innovation do you think it will bring to the dApps that are currently built on Fantom?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let me start with keepers. I think what's interesting is, and I think you outlined some of these examples, Bryce, earlier, but I think with keepers, what we've found is it's really important for people to understand. It's very simple to understand, but once you do understand it, it kind of opens up a whole range of possibilities. But it's really important for the folks listening in to understand that keepers fundamentally is about enabling automation of smart contracts, but importantly doing it in a decentralized and secure way. And the example that I always like to think about is actually the use of time-based triggers, right? It's a really simple idea, but the example I always think of is scheduling a payment, right, at a certain point in time. So we recently launched the kind of Chainlink Keepers job scheduler, which is a very simple UX where users can access a simple interface, register an upkeep, and importantly select a time-based trigger and customize it based on your parameters. So the simple one, just for this example, is to think about this idea of you want to schedule a payment at 12 a.m. On every Tuesday Eastern Standard Time, as an example. So using this interface, you can actually customize that and launch that in a very, very easy way using keepers. But if you understand that concept, that you can automate a function within your smart contract, and I use the example of time-based triggers, but you can use events-based triggers, you can use computational-based triggers, et cetera, et cetera. But if you extrapolate that out to the many complexities of many of the DeFi applications that are built on Fantom, and you look for areas that you would want to improve efficiency, you would want to automate, you would want to make things fundamentally simpler, that's really the fundamental value proposition of keepers. And yes, you can extrapolate it out to a whole range of different use cases, but fundamentally that's the concept. And if you can get that, then I guarantee that when you look at your DeFi application and think about strategically about, well, where would we want to automate things, where would we want to make things more efficient, that's really where keepers adds value. On the VRF side, it's really quite interesting. So it's more, from our perspective, more on the gaming side. So fundamentally, the value proposition of VRF is allowing for trustless random number generation. So making sure that the randomness is generated fairly, it's generated transparently, and it's fundamentally tamper-proof. And then from a user perspective, and again, this is where it gets interesting for those kind of gaming developers out there, is to think about, well, making sure that users get a fair chance to win, a fair chance to be selected at something, using the randomness function. And so then the classic ones to think about there, when you think about gaming, in-game actions, quests, things like dice rolls and card draws and so on and so forth. But fundamentally, again, from a gaming perspective, there's a whole bunch of different use cases, but it's really about making sure that fundamentally users get their fair chance to win, to be selected, to get a reward of some description, and they know that the randomness is truly random and it hasn't been tampered with. And I think, again, once you get that concept, it can be extrapolated to a whole bunch of different and interesting use cases.
Yeah, 100%. Both VRF and Keepers are unlocking so many new possibilities now for developers on Fantom. Michael, I'm curious to hear from you. Like, what are you most excited about now that these services are finally live?
Well, I'm most excited to see like where people take them. And as Nikki mentioned, like I think the primary focus of both of these tools is like really around gaming. I mean, I remember probably about like a year ago now, people would ask me, I think probably on average at least like once a week, sometimes multiple times a week, about when is Keepers going to be integrated, when is VRF going to be integrated. And it's because they all had like games that were, or wanted to deploy services that really needed those kind of those kind of like offerings. And just to take for example like VRF as an example, like the problem with generating randomness as a whole in terms of a computer is like what is randomness, right? Like it's impossible to generate like true randomness when it comes to a computer, because the way that like randomness generates, if you use like dot random function or something like that in a programming language, is that the computer like creates a seed and stores that seeds, right? And the seed is like basically like a sequence of numbers, right? And so if you like run the random function again, you'll get the next number in the sequence, etc. And the problem with like randomness when it comes to smart contracts is that because all the data is like transparent on the network, it means that the seed would also be transparent on the network, meaning that you basically wouldn't have randomness because everybody would know what the predetermined results are. So what like VRF offers is the ability to add randomness back into smart contracts by using an external service. And with their service, you're able to like generate randomness like off chain and prove that randomness is like truly like random, that hasn't been tampered with, and bring the results like back on chain. And that's like a really powerful functionality because that opens up like all sorts of like any chance-based games. I mean, for example, there's like a couple of trading card games on Fantom that want to use randomness because they want to generate these like treasure box, right? Or how like you go to a store and you buy a booster pack and you don't know what cards are in them. They wanted to have the same sort of concept that they could sell like booster packs with all sorts of like trading cards on them, and each trading card is like an NFT. Well, in order to generate that randomness for the booster packs or the treasure chests, they need to use as a service. And now that VRF is available, I think they're using that right now. So anything that requires like any sort of like randomness as part of like the gameplay is very important, and pretty much that's like every single game out there, right? Like if you think about like MMO RPG games that are out there, whenever you kill a creature and you loot it, that's all based on randomness, right? There's a lot of random functions that happen in games, and so having these sorts of services are really essential for allowing people to develop a lot more functional games than would otherwise be possible on Fantom.
Yeah. No, 100%. Basically, every type of gaming application needs some form of randomness. And Michael, from your perspective as well, like, what are your thoughts on keepers, and what it can do for like developers within the Fantom ecosystem?
Yeah, so keepers is another like really important service. I mean, it just allows people to basically like extend the functionality of their applications. It's kind of like Nikki outlined before. People have also asked us about keepers on like a very regular basis. To be honest, they ask a bit more about VRFs. I think it's because of like the gameplay mechanism, but I think keepers also plays like an important role. And each of these like functionalities that like Chainlink has developed basically just like extends the functionality of like all smart contracts, and that can basically be developed on the Fantom network. I mean, first it began with price feeds, mainly for DeFi applications. Now it's extended to all these like different services that you guys are offering.
Awesome. No, 100%. And Nikki, anything else you would like to add there?
Yeah, I think in terms of keepers as well, and just kind of building on what Michael was talking about, I think what's really interesting is some of the use cases that people are working on and kind of will be released soon. So I mean, some of to give people a few examples here. One use case in the keeper sense that's being worked on is the batched reveal. So if you think about, typically in NFT projects, you'll reveal an NFT either on an individual basis after each NFT mint, which can be expensive for users and sometimes causes gas spikes and so on, or it can be done at the end of a collection, and so that can sometimes lead to a frustrating UX. Sometimes users wait weeks for a reveal, for example. And so with the batch reveal and using keepers, what we're trying to do is kind of use keepers to trigger a reveal function once certain conditions have been met. So we talked about those trigger parameters earlier, right? So those trigger parameters could obviously be anything, but some of the ones that are being talked about are using a queue threshold, for example. You'd have progressed to a certain point in the queue, or a certain amount of time has passed, and then you use keepers to then automate that kind of batch reveal. And then that fundamentally, from a user perspective, that solves many of those problems, right? So users will pay a fraction of the minting costs, and they wait a reasonable time for the metadata to be revealed. So that's kind of like a really interesting use case. That will be launched soon. And another one that's being talked about as well is kind of weighted probabilities. So and similar to kind of the examples that Michael was talking about earlier, you have projects that will offer random prizes that are often interested in to reward kind of loyal users, and typically those kind of that loyalty, it's via a lottery or an NFT whitelist, and it's assigned a probability based on token holder or kind of high volume users. And this can lead to kind of really expensive on-chain computation, which isn't necessarily scalable. It can potentially lead to network congestion and so on. And so again, this is where a lot of the value that keepers can add is that a lot of that keepers can be used to kind of trustlessly offload those calculations in terms of those kind of weights, the high volume users, and figuring out which ones should be awarded those prizes. And then you can also calculate the probability of addresses winning, and then use VRF to select a winner randomly, for example, in a particular tier of users as well. So there's a really interesting combination interplay between keepers and VRF as well. So those are just kind of two examples just to kind of make it real for everybody. But again, once you start to play with the technology, and again, I used the simple example of keepers earlier with the time-based trigger. But again, once you start looking at firstly automation, there's a lot you can do, and then secondly, some of these more perhaps value-adding use cases as well, which are directly affecting the UX. It can have a really substantial impact. So I think, like, from a keeper's perspective, we're still at the very early stages of the impact that the technology can have.
Yeah, I think I speak for everyone at Chainlink Labs. We're all just super excited to see all the dApps and applications build with Keepers and VRF on Fantom and see what you guys come up with. And yeah, like definitely tag us at Chainlink when you guys launch new services. Would love to see what you guys are putting together and building. Every project counts in this space, and yeah, would love to see everyone's work. Michael, would love to transition this now to a little bit more of like future thought. Yeah, what would love to learn, like what are you most excited about now for the rest of 2020 that's on Fantom's roadmap for the rest of the year?
Yeah, so there's kind of like two areas I like to talk about. Foundation is focused first and foremost on building out the underlying technology, and we're also focus on growing, like helping people like launch with Fantom and basically growing the ecosystem. So that comes down to like marketing, PR, business development. So like on the technology side, what we're really excited about in particular is that we finally have like pretty much a fully operational, like a dedicated like middleware development team on Fantom right now, led by my old professor Bernard Scholz, and there's two other former PhD students of his that have also joined the team. There's another one joining from Google in Switzerland on the 1st of August, and there might be even like a couple more people after that joining. And what they're going to be working on is basically solving a lot of the bottlenecks issues around the execution of smart contracts. So when you're processing a transaction, there's actually a lot of potential bottlenecks in terms of like how a transaction first gets submitted from the user to be ended up to end up being fully confirmed within the ledger itself. One of the bottlenecks is obviously consensus, but that's not the only bottleneck. There are many like different bottlenecks on many stages in terms of transaction processing. And so one of the stages of transaction processing is going through what's known as a middleware layer. And this is sort of like a software layer that interacts with the application above and also the underlying consensus below. So what happens is, someone submits like a smart contract transaction with a whole bunch of data from an app, so that goes via an API, and then that has to get processed by the middleware layer below. And the middleware layer basically executes the smart contract interaction and kind of like saves the result and passes the result to the chain to be confirmed within a block, right? And so in terms of like the middleware, there's bottlenecks in terms of like transaction processing. So for example, like the speed that like reads and writes are done, right? So the data that like is like read from the chain to the middleware, and the data that's like saved from the after the virtual machine has done its like execution, the result that's like saved from the middleware to the chain is quite slow. And in fact, we've done like a lot of profiling on our chain recently, and we've got an article come out very, very soon that kind of details a lot of that sort of research that we've done. And we found out that, in terms of like transaction processing, just this like reading and writing can consume, like well over like half of the total transaction time frame in terms of like executing a smart contract interaction. So we have solutions in mind on how to solve these bottlenecks, and each time we solve these bottlenecks and push it through production, it just leads to faster transactions. And in the end, what we care about is the user experience, and optimizing transaction processing to get faster transactions, cheaper transactions, and also increase the security of transactions is what really matters in the end. And that's the same sort of thing with our core development as well. We're looking into changes in how to modify our proof of stake mechanism to make it safer and kind of like more fair across validators, as well as like increase the performance in terms of like how our consensus is actually done. So there's a lot of like research and development that's coming out with continuously hired more engineers on the core middleware development. So there's a lot of exciting stuff there. And in terms of the business development, what I'm really interested in the past few months is I noticed that